Good morning, everyone. I wanted to respond to some comments left by Nai61a. I think that's your username. Pardon me if I've got that wrong. This is going to be out of order, I think, with some other videos that I've got sort of waiting in the wings right now. I've recorded them. I'm sort of in the process of uploading them, but, despite being retired now, I've got a lot of stuff that I'm doing, and so I fit stuff in when I can. And I appreciate the response or the comments because I felt like they were in the spirit of maybe reaching out to clarify rather than just being dismissive and completely adversarial. Anyway, at the beginning, and I'm gonna have to paraphrase because of course I'm just going for my walk. I don't have the comments in front of me. He said something about, you quoted me saying that, majority rule or democracy is immoral. And you asked if I have an alternative, a workable solution that would not lead to violent conflicts. And no, I don't. I mean, that is to say, I've got ideas, and this is not something for one person obviously to work out, right? This is a conversation that should be had, which I don't think we're really having. I've got some ideas. As I've said before on my channel, I'm sort of an armchair political anarchist. So, not just anarchy, but political anarchism, which is kind of the actual acknowledgement, I think, of the actual morality of the whole matter, the actual moral rights, you might say, that we have to impose ourselves on one another, and what the limitations are of those, and an acknowledgement of the limitations of those. You might call me a voluntarist. Libertarian is probably a little too restrictive for where I sort of sit. And again, I think in terms of how can I impose my will on someone else, and do those odds improve, or do I have more right if I am coupled with several other people? This idea of majority rule, right? Do more people have rights than fewer people? But again, I think that's something where much conversation needs to be taken place, and probably we need to, as a species, evolve some more, right? Before we're capable of that. That's why I say armchair anarchist, because I have a recognition that I don't even advocate for it in a way, because I acknowledge that human beings just aren't probably ready for the kind of actual personal responsibility that is required for something like a system like that, where it's far more on a kind of an honor system. And that's not to say that groups of people could not act together to stop someone from taking advantage, from overstepping their moral bounds, kind of thing. But it's a different paradigm, obviously, and I don't think we're ready for it. Having said that, you said, do I have a workable solution that wouldn't lead to violent conflict? And I guess I would ask the question is, why does my potential system of governance, why is that a stipulation on mine and not of the current one? Because you can't say, of course, that our current system doesn't lead to violent conflict. I mean, there's violent interpersonal conflict, there's violent intimate conflict, there's violent international conflict, there's oppression. Again, this is something that I've been talking about on my channel, the whole idea of majority rule, and a lack of recognition of the ethical problems with majority rule is actually, I think, what leads to the potential to oppress smaller groups of people, rightly or wrongly, because you can get away with it. And so, that's the reason I try to have these conversations, is because I see these things, and again, I think in terms of what right do I have to impose my will on another person, and sort of start from there. And yes, I get it. There are problems with even that, obviously, which is why I would advocate for having a conversation about it. Two things can be true at once, of course. You know, like I can see the problems with our current system and point that out, and not necessarily have a completely workable solution ready to just swap it out with. I mean, you know, that's a bit much to ask, I think. But, you know, if you see ethical problems with something, pointing it out, I don't think there should be anything wrong with that. I mean, you know, I could be in the same position back in the days of slavery and be advocating to abolish slavery, and somebody might say, yeah, but do you have a workable solution that, you know, that will harvest all these crops and do all of these things, right? And I might say, well, no, I don't. But that doesn't change the fact that slavery itself is immoral. So that's kind of my answer to that. You know, I'm advocating here for conversation. And I think in some ways you've mistaken what I'm saying, or you're reading some things into things, and then you're making some assumptions about my worldview. Because you did say after that, oh, well, we'll get to the worldview last, because that's kind of where you ended it. You also said something about there were people during both world wars who didn't want to fight the wars, and that I seem to be advocating for not defending the country. And that's not the case at all. I very much, you know, if somebody attacked my home, I would defend it. I probably would defend it to the death. I mean, you know, my family lives there. So, you know, I'm not a pacifist in that regard. I think, you know, you have the right to self-defense. Personally, nationally, you know, you have that right. So it's funny because Overnator made the same mistake in thinking that I'm saying that people of the Ukraine should just stand down. That somehow I'm making, you know, a value judgment on whether or not it's right for them to fight or something like that. I'm not. None of the observations I've made are actually talking about the oughts of the people of the Ukraine. I'm talking about other issues and what's ultimately going to happen. Now, maybe even what's in the best interest from my perspective of the people of the Ukraine. But I have no judgment on those people, even if they're making what I would deem to be the wrong decision. And again, I'm not saying it's the wrong decision. I'm saying even if, right? That's the thing I think you have to understand about me is I'm thinking in very broad terms. I have a recognition and acknowledgement that I don't know what's right for the Ukrainian people because I'm not them and I'm not there. As much as I try to educate myself, I'm aware that if I were not one of them, I'd have a hard time understanding. And I would have a hard time understanding if I were them too, probably, because I think they're heavily propagandized, as are we. This is why you can't have a government. I mean, you can, but this is what you're going to get, right? Like, that's just how that works. And so, and yes, there are degrees and levels of variance, you know, in that regard. But in general, this is what you're going to get. So, no, I'm not saying that the people who were invaded and the people who were otherwise provoked during the two world wars shouldn't have fought, shouldn't have tried to defend their nations. I'm not saying that at all. I'm trying to have the conversation. Like, I think if you don't have the conversation and you don't have arguments, like I mean actual productive arguments where people make logical, rational arguments, people make observations about the reality on the ground, challenge one another's assumptions and arguments, challenge one another's data, you know, supposed facts and things like that, you know, point out, and I mean in a really comprehensive way, like pointing out revisionist history and false narratives and have really good, productive, good faith arguments. Like, that's what I'm advocating for here. I think the opposite of what you accused me of, which is bigotry. and so we'll get to the worldview stuff now, I guess. You'd said you hadn't watched much of my videos recently, for quite a while actually, because you felt that I'd gone off the rails and I become some sort of a right-wing bigot. And I guess the preceding, all of the stuff that I've said to this point should, I would hope, answer the question about bigotry and whatnot. And it's funny too, because of course, like, I view it as you and I disagree. And yes, I've used the terms left wing and stuff like this on my channel before, but I do so reluctantly, because sometimes you do need a label so that you don't have to, spend a half an hour or an hour, as you all know I could easily do, trying to describe that which I'm referring to. Sometimes you need a label, but even then I use them reluctantly. I could view you as a left-wing, ideologue or something like that, but I don't. I think that you and I probably disagree on a number of issues, more accurately, and that we should be able to engage in arguments, good faith arguments, about those things. And in some ways, what does concern me is that you've already, without doing it, you've already kind of dismissed me as a right-wing bigot. And so I think there's some componentry of that that's like lost cause, like you said, off the rails, very similar kind of language, I think. And that almost damaged goods sort of thing. Instead of coming to the conclusion that, we may disagree on certain issues. And by the way, there is a certain amount of bigotry in that, is there not? In just dismissing somebody because you think they disagree with you, and you're obviously right, they're wrong, and they seem to be attached to those wrong beliefs. So therefore, hand wave them away. I'm not saying you're a bigot. I'm saying sometimes a mirror is a good idea. Sometimes a mirror is a good idea. Right? Like, just think about that determination on your part that, I'm trying to be fair and generous here. I'm not saying that you accused me directly of being a bigot, but you did sort of say you kind of wondered if I had become a right-wing bigot, right? What's the difference between you and me in that regard? If we both have strongly held beliefs, I see this a lot, and again, at the risk of using labels, which I prefer not to do, I see this a lot mostly with people on the left side of the political spectrum. And what it boils down to, if you interview them, and I've seen a number of these interviews where they're even encouraged to go to speak to someone. I saw a video recently which was interesting. Right-wing gathering, with Trump signs, let's say, and some more left-leaning people sort of yelling at them from across the street, and someone wades into the crowd and says, what don't you like about those guys? And they say, oh, they're horribly wrong on everything. And then they say, well, I think sometimes these things come about from misunderstanding and a lack of communication. Would you be interested in going over there with me and talking to them and seeing if you can reach some common ground? Absolutely not. I don't have time for those people, et cetera, et cetera. I see that mostly on that side of the political aisle. Now, that could be, what's curated to me, although I would submit that I take an active part in gathering my own information and evidence. However, it could be that that's just the biased way that I see it. But I think my point stands. What is the difference? What is the difference between you and me? We both have strongly held beliefs, and it could very well be that both of us are somewhat resistant to changing those beliefs. Why am I the potential bigot? Why is that the case? I mean, in some ways, by definition, you've withdrawn from the conversation because of your perception of me as potentially, a right-wing bigot, or just, sort of disagreeing with you. That kind of fits the definition. Is it because you're right and I'm wrong? And if you don't see the problem with that, right, like, why have I not dismissed you to the scrap heap of human irrelevance by considering you to be a left-wing bigot or ideologue? Because I don't. Again, I think we probably disagree on a number of issues, but I don't buy that narrative, and I think it's pretty disingenuous, actually, to dismiss a whole group of people like that without acknowledging that you're not engaging with them to determine sort of how dogmatic they are before you come to this conclusion, like personally on an individual level, right? I mean, we do this, we collectivize people, so we decide that all people of that feather are exactly the same, and that's something I'm vehemently opposed to. It's obviously a huge mistake. It's the worst form of discrimination, I think. And I mean, it is the worst form of discrimination because it's really the one that allows people to give themselves that license to do horrible things to the other side, right? Much more difficult to do things to the other side if you treat people as individuals, and you would have to actually get to know each person individually before you could make some determination as to the validity of your violent acts against them or something like that. I'm not accusing you of the violence, by the way. I'm just saying in general, this is how historically we come to these conclusions, I think. We both think we're right. And there's an arrogance in thinking you're right to such a degree that obviously that other person, if they're dogmatic and entrenched, it's because they're some sort of a bigot or an ideologue, and you're so entrenched because you're correct. Now, if this describes you in an honest way, if you can honestly look at yourself and recognize that that's the case, then again, I would recommend the mirror of quiet introspection. If it doesn't describe you, then I'm not describing you. Okay, I'm describing other people that I know and have witnessed that behave in this way. But I do think that there's value in analyzing this difference between people and the determination that one person is a bigot and the other person is just righteous, And I mean, that can happen on all sides of the political spectrum, of course. But I do see more willingness to engage from people who are typically on the right side of the political aisle. And by the way, of course, the sides of the aisle have changed a lot in the last 30 years or so, I would submit. I think they've always been in flux, but I'm using the terms very broadly here. But I think you know what I mean. But I would hope by now that you'd have recognized that I'm open to argumentation. And I'm open to having arguments made that I can't answer to. I engage in hot tub deliberations pretty much every night where I try to work out different scenarios to their logical conclusions and try to take the best. I've said this before on my channel, that I had a conclusion, or a position, I should say, on abortion. And it was largely asserted on me by my father when I was 13-ish, something like that. We were watching a TV show and the topic came up, and I made a statement that was not well thought out on my part. It was really just regurgitating sort of common tropes that I'd heard out there. And my dad barked at me. And without knowing it in the moment, my position had been formed. Person of authority, being very assertive, correcting me in the moment. And I held that position until into my mid-30s. And then one day I realized, as I started to delve into the world of philosophy and logical argument and things like that, that I held this position very firmly, but I didn't have good reason for it. So I engaged in a campaign of self-discovery and exploration through, the minefield that is the abortion argument. And I exposed myself to what I think are the best of the arguments on both sides. I watched a lot of videos. I tended to reject people who were just making arguments from assertion. I tended to reject people who were not capable or willing to entertain arguments from the other side, the bigots. And I formulated my position based on that. And I feel like now I can defend that position. And of course, most importantly, I have to defend it to myself, because the idea here is to hold what I think to be true beliefs or righteous positions for the right reasons. And I think that's the opposite of a bigot or an ideologue. And I kind of am curious as to where you even get that, because I'd like to know, if you just take the pure definition of a bigot. Oh, stop making noise. If you take the pure definition of bigot, generally speaking, one component of bigotry is the outright rejection of a group of people based on kind of arbitrary metrics. Often ideological, but it doesn't have to be the case. And I'm just trying to figure out where I've ever advocated for that on my channel, where I've ever expressed views that are dismissive of groups of people simply because of, even ideological position, let alone arbitrary metrics that they can't really control. I don't think I've ever done that. My whole position has been we should be able to argue well. And when I have, I think, voiced any concerns about, let's say, a group of people, the only group of people I can think of that I've expressed real concerns about on my channel is actually other atheists. Because I've kind of come to recognize that after sort of being done with the presuppositional apologetic stuff, which is kind of how I started my channel, which is why I have the audience that I do, which is kind of ironic. Maybe things happen for a reason, right? But once I got done with that, I actually started to recognize that when we get into other conversations, I don't have as much in common with my fellow atheists. And I'm actually more comfortable probably living in a community surrounded by Christians than I would be by, let's say, LA atheists or something like that. The kind of a little bit more, to my view, radical viewpoints. And, and you might say, there's the bigotry coming out. Well, the funny thing about that is the radical viewpoints I'm talking about are things, first of all, that I'm willing to discuss and argue. And again, I mean argue in that constructive way in which, dialogue and discourse and debate, right? Not just natter at each other, not firebomb each other's mailboxes and stuff like that. But, and some of those topics are things like subjective morality and objective morality, of course. I've tried to have those conversations. I do know that I'd had a couple of videos when I was making videos from my father's place where I discussed, some pretty, I think, out there viewpoints of some feminists. But I was never rejecting, I wasn't dismissing all feminists. I wasn't obviously being misogynist. I wasn't, being dismissive of women or making value judgments about women or making broad statements about women, disparaging commentary or anything like that. I was talking about very specific actions and behaviors and attitudes of specific people. And of course, the whole point was to engage in some kind of dialogue, to engage in some argumentation. And by the way, I think that's a common tactic used, and I'm not accusing you of this necessarily because I don't know what the sort of evidence is that comprises, the preponderance of evidence that you needed to come to the conclusion that I might have gone off the rails. But this is a common tactic that's used quite often. So, if a person is criticizing a particular narrative or a speech that's been given or someone's position on a certain subject, then others who would like to discredit that person that's doing the critique, what they'll do is they'll just apply their criticism to all members of the group that the person they're criticizing, holds membership in or whatever. And that way they can dismiss the criticizer as being discriminatory, being a bigot, being a, racist, homophobe, misogynist, whatever it is. And this is a debate tactic. And I mean, I don't mean formal debate. I mean, it's a rhetorical kind of device that people use. And I think it's wholly disingenuous, obviously. But you can see it employed all over the place. And of course, what they do is they engage in the mind reading. So it's malevolent. It's the commandeering of intent, right? So they don't inquire further to determine, are you saying this about all women or whatever the group is, right? And then the person and you can engage in that argument to determine this. No, they do the mind reading and they commandeer the other person's intent. In other words, they say, this is what this person meant, and that they can use to then discredit them. And this is absolutely rampant. This is so commonplace now as to be the state of our current state of affairs. It's wholly disingenuous. It should be called out whenever it's done, but of course people don't do it because they like it when it's used to make their point, when it supports their argument. I see people on all sides of the political spectrum doing this. It's disgusting to me. And that's why I've made videos before on collectivism and the commandeering of intent. This idea that you can mind read and determine other people's motives and positions on things, and then broadcast that to the universe in an attempt to discredit that person, relegate them to the scrap heap of human irrelevance, and not have to deal with them anymore. Or at least that's I think what's going on here. That's what they're trying to do. And I really think that needs to stop. And so it's kind of one of those things that I think maybe, and I'm just suggesting this, maybe you're developing this opinion of me as a right-wing bigot that's gone off the rails or whatever. It's perhaps, and I think this is why it's good to think about these things, perhaps it says more about you than it does about me. And introspection is always healthy. I read your comments and I thought a good lot about them. Could this person be right? What have I said that might lead this person to believe this? Let's look at the other comments the person has made, and see if there's any indication here that this person might be mind reading. And I'm not saying you're doing this, mind reading, which is one of my biggest pet peeves, by the way. Just ask a fucking question. Don't delve into mind reading. Don't give me the perhaps you think that the invasion of Poland in 1939 wasn't immoral too. That's not good faith conversation, right? Dialogue to do that. But anyway, I'm not saying that. I'm saying these are the questions that I ask myself. Could the person be engaging in mind reading? Or are they just making assumptions? Or are they, reading things into it based on their paradigm and a lack of knowledge about my actual positions on things, and they're filling in the gaps, right? And that's kind of my most charitable assessment of that, by the way, is I think that probably what's happened is you've heard some things I've said. I haven't been crystal clear on exactly what I mean by certain things sometimes. You disagree with me on some positions. The rest you don't know because I haven't made clear. And so you've filled in the gaps a little bit, probably based on what you know of other right-wing bigots, I guess. I don't know. That's kind of the most charitable take that I could have. But obviously I would allow you the courtesy of correcting me if that's not correct as well. What have I said? What have I said in the past? Could this person be right? How does this conclusion on a certain topic make me a bigot? Is there something I'm not seeing here? This stuff is all very important, and I engage in it all the time. And again, I don't think that's the behavior of a bigot. And I've discussed this stuff many times, and I've always been open. I've made videos correcting myself when it's been pointed out that I've been wrong on subjects. So I'm open to the label being accurate. I just don't see it. I don't think that I fit or qualify. I think that at some point it's a good idea to acknowledge when we actually just disagree on a topic, and then be as willing to analyze and critique your own position as you are your opponent. Because a lot of times we tend to come at it from the position of, well, I know I'm right. And so, this kind of means obviously that the other person is wrong. And then if they're vehemently kind of attached to their position or whatever, well, then obviously they're a bigot, right? Because that's kind of the primary definition of bigotry, or ideologue or whatever. And never once giving any potentiality to the fact that you might be wrong, and maybe not in whole, maybe just in part. Maybe some of the core fundamentals of your position you actually have incorrect data on, or you haven't actually given enough importance to thoroughly understanding the opponent's viewpoint from their position. I mean, that's what I had to do with the abortion discussion, is I had to really try to view things from the viewpoint of the opposition. And I don't think that's very often done these days. Most arguments are quite emotional. They're emotion driven. And, there's not a lot of genuine desire to understand things from the opponent's point of view. And I at least try to do that. I mean, give me a little credit. Anyway, that's kind of why I wanted to answer this. Otherwise, I was going to put this one on the waiting list. And I think it's kind of important because this isn't just necessarily disagreeing about specifics of a conflict or something like that, but this is a person saying, you fundamentally, I've relegated you to the scrap heap of human irrelevance, and I appreciate that you at least reached out. Like, I do appreciate that. I think that's what we need to do more of, is to try to clarify, try to get a better insight, try to request further information. So I hope that helps. Again, with respect to the specifics that you mentioned in the early part of your comment, it's more about having a conversation and trying to determine what actually is in all aspects of whatever it is we're discussing, and then try to have discourse about what ought to be in light of what is. So when I talk about what is, and I'm not focusing on the obvious broad thing like, Russia invaded Ukraine, because I'm not mentioning that does not mean I don't know that happened, or that it's immoral on its face. The reason I'm talking about other aspects is because those are still components of what is, and I feel like those things often get ignored. Like how many people are talking about the deficit finance of foreign aid. The sovereign debt that's created on both sides when we're engaging in this. How many people are actually discussing that? Is it not important? Especially in light of all the things that are happening. In light of the rampant inflation, and then now, we've got a stock market that's in crisis, and people are already in crisis financially and economically. You said something about that I seem to allude to some golden era, which in your mind never existed, and that things would be better if we just went back there. I've never once said that, but it's kind of hard to ignore that. I mean, I guess my position would be this, just to clarify that, because that's one point I didn't go on, and then I'll end this video. No, I'm not a conservative in that sense. I'm actually, if you wanted to pin me down somehow, I'm fiscally highly conservative when it comes to government. I mean, obviously, I'm a political anarchist. I don't really believe that taxation itself is moral, especially not when you move into the, what we tax people for these days. I mean, it's insane, and it's quite obviously immoral anyway. Deficit finance, I think, is immoral. It'd be one thing if they ever paid the debts down, but we're sort of obviously not doing that now. And when you put that sovereign debt on top of everything else, it makes countries unstable. I mean, it's literally, I mean, people call it a sovereign debt crisis, right? And there's a reason for that. So I'm fiscally highly conservative, personally quite liberal, like in terms of what I think people ought to be able to do, you know, in the comfort of their own bedroom or their own home or whatever. I'm a voluntarist, so I believe that, you know, people should be able to engage in voluntary interaction without the interference of other people to a point, obviously. And obviously there are many definitions that need to go into that. What people can, you know, when is someone an adult capable of entering into voluntary interactions? What constitutes a voluntary interaction? How does coercion and force enter into that, and all of that? I'm just saying in a very broad sense. I'm a voluntarist. And so, you know, the very fact that I'm sort of personally liberal doesn't really speak to conservatism, I don't think. However, having said that, of course, progressivism, you know, the idea that progress for progress's sake is a good thing, I don't think is right. So as nature usually teaches us, there's usually a balance somewhere. And I wouldn't even say in the middle, but there's usually a balance somewhere. That things in extremes generally don't tend to work out well. And so, you know, to me, it's arguable that there were aspects of previous eras that were desirable, that are preferable to what's going on now. I think that, for instance, a lot of the social problems caused by the World Wide Web are undesirable. I don't think it's desirable. As much as I'm a culturally liberal person, I don't think that what's happening in our modern age between young men and young women specifically, and Western birth rates and OnlyFans models and you know, high levels of promiscuity and all of that, I don't think that's a societal good. And I don't think it's an individual good for most people either. And I think those things are arguable. In other words, I think that I've got good points on those topics, and I think a lot of people do. And I think we ought to be having more discourse, more dialogue about that. Do I think we can put the genie back in the bottle? Probably not. But if we were going to do it in a voluntary way, the way to do it would be to reach people who are otherwise, you know, engaged in these behaviors and make the case to them. Try to point it out, because I don't think it's good for people. And so, you know, does that mean that I think we should just go back to 1956? No, and I never said that. You know, again, it's one of those things, I guess that's the problem with this kind of discourse, where we're not actually having a conversation, where you don't just interject and say the thing and I can dispense with it right away. I make a bunch of statements, but I don't fill in the gaps, because that's not what I'm talking about in the moment. And you hear the statements and you go, well, those are the things that someone on the right wing, a right-wing conservative, would say. Therefore, this person must be a right-wing conservative. And that's totally understandable. There's not a critique or an objection coming from me on that. I think it's the nature of the beast, right? And just so you know, that's not where I'm coming from. I do think there are aspects of, especially society and our world, that were better. Arguably, to me, conclusively. But again, I recognize that I could be wrong and would be open to discourse on that. And I'm also of the opinion that there are many aspects of our current system and culture and society or whatever that I would not want to change. I would not want to revert to something previous, something prior. So, no, I don't think that things were universally better at some point in history. I don't think that's how any of this works, actually, anyway. Probably a lot of conservatives, if you challenge them on specific things, would actually acquiesce and say, well, actually, no, you're probably right. That I wouldn't change, or whatever. I think it's quite likely. I think a lot of this stuff is one of these things where you end up, again, rejecting people to a scrap heap of human irrelevance because you disagree with them ideologically. But if you actually got to know that person, you'd find out, oh, this is a good person. We disagree, but they're not a bad person. And I think that's kind of paradigm shaking. It should be, it ought to be. You know, and I think that's why we've become so polarized. It's not that people didn't disagree back in time. It feels like the polarization has increased, right? And like the vehement polarization. But it does seem to me to be because I think, first of all, sort of activists on both sides have largely closed off the dialogue. And a lot of it's by making, inflammatory or incendiary assertions about the other side and whatnot. You know, they basically dismiss one another as being evil, not just wrong, but evil. And of course, you can't argue with evil. You can argue with wrong, but you can't argue with evil. And so, this is why I've said many times on my channel, I don't like the idea of relegating your opponents to the scrap heap of human irrelevance and dismissing them as evil. Because I think that it doesn't help any of us. It's bad. It's bad for us. We don't disagree well. So anyway, and I'm not accusing you of that because you did actually reach out, seek clarification. I'd be interested to know what you think. All of you. All right. I'm gonna stop. Have a good day.